Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. I wanted to make a video because I've had several people ask me the same question. Over the past couple weeks, I've had people say, why didn't we finish the book of Mark? If you've been around the Oaks for the past few years, you know that throughout kind of the winter, spring, we've journeyed through the book of Mark together through a series that we've called Walking with Jesus. And then on Easter, we stopped at verse 8, and some people were saying, hey, there are more verses here. I've got verses 9 through 20 in chapter 16, and we didn't touch them. Why didn't we finish the book of Mark? Well, my response would be, we did finish the book of Mark, and I know that that deserves some explanation. Now, whenever we think about Scripture, we have autographs, which is the way that you refer to the original autograph, or the original document that was penned by the author Mark himself. Well, we don't have the autograph, but we do have manuscripts, these reliable resources that were copied of the Scriptures as they were originally written. Well, some of our most reliable manuscripts, the earliest dated manuscripts, do not contain verses 9 through 20. And yet, over time, they've been historically used. There's no contradictory doctrine in them. And so, in many ways, the translators feel comfortable putting those in the copy of the Scriptures that you have. So, for example, I use the ESV, and there it is, but it's bracketed just to say these verses are in a lot of manuscripts, but whenever we look at some of the most reliable manuscripts, they're not in there. Even church history shows that these verses most likely came at a later date. So you have early church fathers like Origen or Clement of Alexandria, and they don't reference these verses at all, which means that during their time period, these verses probably had not been written yet and were not a part of that original inspired Scripture that God was penning through the hand of John Mark. We also see that some of the older manuscripts don't have verses 9 through 20, but then someone later, like the church father Irenaeus, he is familiar with these verses and he is able to reference them. But because some of the older manuscripts lack these verses, we don't use them. There's also just kind of a linguistic difference or stylistic difference in verses 9 through 20 compared to the rest of the book of Mark that isn't characteristic of Mark's style of writing. Some of the ways that he structures sentences, some of the words that he's using or isn't using don't seem like they line up with the rest of the book of Mark, which probably means that it was written by a scribe later to try to harmonize some of the Gospels and try to fill in the gaps of what it seemed to be missing at the end. For us, that means that we just kind of read verses 9 through 20 with caution. There's nothing in these verses that would cause us to believe something different about who Jesus is or have really any significant impact on our doctrine, because most of the things that are said in verses 9 through 20 are found in the other three gospel accounts in Matthew, Luke, and John. Now, some people ask, well, why does Mark end like this? I mean, think about the end of Mark. I even kind of felt the tension as I was preaching it, because the book ends and there's an empty tomb and the angel announces that Christ has risen, but you don't see Christ bodily raised. You don't get to see him in his glorified body. And then as the women are running away from the tomb to the disciples, it says that they are terrified. And you want them to be full of joy. You want them to be excited, and yet they are terrified. Now, why would there be such an abrupt ending to the book of Mark? Well, some people think, maybe the ending of the original autograph was lost somehow, and so we don't have it. And so, Mark wrote more, but for some reason in God's sovereignty, we just don't have those verses. A portion of the original was lost. I tend to believe that this is how Mark wrote it. I mean, think about the way that it's almost as if you go through the book of Mark, it seems like he's constantly almost giving an opportunity for the reader to respond. And I think that's what he does here again at the end of this gospel. He's saying the tomb is empty, the facts have been laid out throughout this entire book. You've seen that Jesus is the Son of God. Now do you believe it? Do you believe that he is truly risen from the dead? And I believe this is an invitation for us to respond and say, yes, we do. We believe that he indeed is the risen Son of God. Now, let me just ask the question, why would this longer ending exist if it's not a part of Scripture? Well, we could, understand that this kind of felt uncomfortable at the end, and a scribe later came along and said, we have these other, documents, these other gospels that round out the ending. So a scribe most likely came along and said, I want to harmonize these other gospels and kind of put in the appearance of the bodily resurrected Christ to, add the Great Commission, to add some of the things that took place in the book of Acts and the ascension of Christ. And so ultimately, I think that's what you have taking place here. Some of those things that take place in the book of Acts that are alluded to in Mark 16 is speaking in new tongues. We see that on the day of Pentecost, that Paul was bit by a snake in Acts 28, but the venom did not affect him. They lay hands on the sick and they recover. Even in this case, kind of whenever Christ gives this Great Commission, this is what Jesus says will happen and did happen. And we also recognize that Jesus isn't giving a command here for us to go and drink poison or handle snakes. It's not a command, but Jesus, as he is saying these things, he is telling the disciples there, if these things happen, that this is a promise that he would preserve them and protect them. Now, how significant is this? Well, it matters, but I would say that there is nothing that is core to our doctrine that is affected by these scriptures. Because as I said before, everything that is said in the longer ending of Mark that I do not believe is a part of the inspired scripture is found elsewhere in other Gospels accounts. So what should we do with it? I would say read it. Read it, but treat it like it is not something that John Mark wrote, but something that was added later. I would say reference to the other Gospels. Whenever you're thinking about, okay, what did Christ say in the Great Commission? Reference Matthew 28. Whenever you're thinking about, whenever it says that there were two men journeying to the countryside, and they went back and they told the disciples and they didn't believe it. Well, you should go to Luke's account of what took place on the road to Emmaus to fully understand that, because these references are true. And at the same time, we don't believe that this was the original way that this book was written. I would say trust the Bible. Don't get nervous because there are brackets here. This should help you to understand that we have a mountain of manuscripts and they are each carefully examined so that the Bible that you hold in your hands is just as God intended for you to have it, has His inspired word, and that is a huge blessing. So a conversation like this should cause you to trust the Bible even more because God has sovereignly preserved His scriptures for our edification and so that we can know Him better and glorify Him through it. And then just kind of the personal decision to not preach this scripture came from my conviction that I believe that the power of preaching is whenever the authority of preaching is built upon the foundation of God's inspired word. And so whenever there's brackets around a text and I'm not convinced that this was a part of God's original autograph, I might reference it, but I wouldn't make it the primary text that is going to be the basis of my exposition. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this answered some of the questions. And as always, shoot me a text, give me a call, send me an email because I love talking about stuff like this with you. Hope this serves you well. Love you, Oaks Church. See you soon.